What do you do when you know what matters to you, but you just don't feel like doing it anymore? Today, we're talking about what happens when motivation disappears in the middle of the work. By the end of this, you'll have a simple way to keep going on the days that you don't feel like it without relying on motivation.
Welcome to the Live Right Now podcast with me, Allan. This is where mindfulness meets everyday life. Thanks for joining me for this reflection on living with intention. Let's talk about how we can live right now.
Hello, beautiful souls. I'm Allan, and welcome to Live Right Now. There are times when starting something is hard, but there are also times when you've already started and suddenly the harder part is staying with it. Now, that's where I've been lately. Not stuck at the beginning, but somewhere in the middle where motivation fades and everything starts to feel heavier than it did when you first said yes to it. And what I've been learning is that this isn't really a motivation problem. It's a continuation problem. It's about what you do when the feeling that got you started isn't there anymore, but the commitment still is. So let's talk about that. Most people assume the hardest part of doing something meaningful is starting it. That's not always true. Starting has energy behind it. There's clarity, urgency, even optimism. You can borrow motivation from possibility, but somewhere after the beginning, that support starts to fade. The novelty wears out, the result is no longer immediate, and what you're left with is something much more difficult: the work itself, without the emotional push that got you there. That's where a lot of people stop, not because they don't care anymore, but because motivation stops showing up on schedule. And this is where we tend to misunderstand ourselves. We assume that if we don't feel like doing something, it must mean we're not committed to it. But that's not actually how behavior works. Motivation is unstable. It rises and falls. It's reactive, not reliable. So the question isn't, how do I stay motivated? It's, how do I keep moving when motivation stops working? Because if your entire system depends on how you feel, then your consistency will always be at the mercy of your worst days. Most people think discipline is about pushing harder when things get difficult, but that misses the real point entirely. Discipline is a design problem, not a willpower problem. You build it before the hard moment arrives. So when resistance shows up, the decision is already made. We tend to think strong people are the ones who override how they feel. But more often, they're the ones who have built guardrails to remove how much they had to decide in the first place. Guardrails are decisions you make before motivation disappears. So you don't have to decide in the moment whether you feel like showing up. Because most follow through breaks down in that moment when you find yourself facing negotiation, hesitation, and reevaluation. Not because you're weak, but because you're human. And once you understand that, you stop trying to win every moment, and you start building systems that carry you through them instead. Now, here's what that looks like. First, you pre-decide your minimum. Before a low motivation day arrives, you define the smallest version of showing up that still counts, whatever it takes to keep you going. 10 minutes of work, one paragraph, opening the file and starting the timer. You decide this in advance, not in the moment when negotiation is easiest to lose. Second, you make starting easier than avoiding. Most resistance lives at the point of activation, not continuation. So you remove the friction before it matters. Leave the document open. Prep your materials the night before. Make the cost of beginning so low that doing nothing actually takes more effort. Third, you protect the time itself. The work happens at a fixed point regardless of mood. Tuesdays at 7, always. This removes motivation entirely as a scheduling input. Guardrails aren't about winning that negotiation, they're about canceling it. And once you stop relying on willpower in the moment, you start to see something else. Most breakdowns don't happen because people just quit. They happen because they pause and never come back. Once you've stepped away, even briefly, your mind starts reinterpreting the story. Now, I'll get back to it later. It feels reasonable. But later stretches, and what started as a pause becomes an exit. Now, this is where the minimum viable action does its real work. Not by lowering your standards, but by keeping the loop connected and protecting continuity when your energy drops below what you expected. Because here's what that loop actually produces: not just output, not just results, evidence. Evidence of what you value, of what you do when it would be easier not to. And that evidence is what your mind uses to define who you are. Repeated actions beat milestone moments, especially the small ones that only you will ever see. You don't need to perform at your best on a low motivation day. You just need to keep showing up, because presence is what keeps the evidence accumulating. And what you keep coming back to is the accumulating evidence that slowly reshapes how you see yourself. You're always in the process of becoming something based on what you repeatedly do when it's easiest not to. Most people think change happens when you finally decide to be different. But more often, it happens when you keep doing something small, even after the feeling that started it is gone. That's the moment where identity starts to shift, not in the decision, but in the repetition. It's easy to feel committed when something is new. It's harder when nothing is exciting anymore and you're left with just the work itself. But that's exactly where identity is formed. You don't need to be perfect in those moments. You just need to keep going. Because every time you do, you're casting a vote for the kind of person you're becoming. And those votes accumulate, whether you're watching or not. Every commitment has a dip. That stretch where the novelty is gone, the result isn't visible yet, and motivation has nothing left to offer. And here's what changes when you've shown up enough times to have the evidence support you. The dip stops being a threat. Not because it stops happening, it'll always happen. Motivation will always be unreliable. There will always be days when the work feels heavier than it should, and the reasons you started feel further away than you'd like. But something changes when you've been through enough of those days and you kept going anyway. You stop interpreting the dip as a signal that something is wrong. You've accumulated enough evidence of your own follow through that you know, not intellectually, but firsthand, that, like one of my favorite quotes says, everything will be all right in the end. If it's not all right, it's not the end. Well, that's what consistency without negotiation actually feels like from the inside. Not motivation exactly, just the absence of the debate that used to slow you down. And what that consistency produces isn't perfection. It was never going to be perfection. Practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes progress. And progress, even when it's slow, even when it's unremarkable, compounds in ways that peak performance on your best days never quite can, because it's always available, even on the worst ones. That's the thing most people miss about showing up on hard days. They think they're just getting through it, but they're actually building something more durable than motivation ever could have built for them. Most people think freedom means having more options, but there's another kind of freedom that you don't hear as much about. It's the freedom that comes from no longer needing everything to fall into place to take the next step. When you've built enough evidence that you can and will do something, even when it's hard. Your mood stops being the deciding vote. Momentum, or lack thereof, stops having veto power. You move forward, not because everything aligned, but because you became someone who moves forward anyway. That's not discipline. That's autonomy. The people who seem most confident aren't the ones who never doubt. They're the ones who acted while the doubt was still there. They didn't get this kind of freedom because they found motivation, but because they stopped requiring it. The goal isn't to feel ready. It's to become someone who doesn't need to. So let's come back to the question that we started with. What do you do when motivation disappears, but the commitment is still there? You can't will motivation back or wait for clarity to return. So here's something you can do. Pick one thing you've committed to. It may be something you're struggling with now. It may be something that's still fresh and exciting. Either way, decide what showing up looks like on a low motivation day. Not the best version, the minimum version that you will do no matter how you feel. Write it down, decide when it happens, and remove one piece of friction standing between you and starting. This episode is my example. This week, I defined my minimum. I sat down and started writing, not because I felt ready, but because it's important to me. And that's it. That's the whole system. The commitment was never about feeling ready. It was about deciding what matters and showing up for it anyway. Thanks for spending some time thinking about this with me today. Until next time, build your guardrails before you need them. Stay in motion. And remember to live right now.
Thanks for being part of Live Right Now. If you like what you've heard, I encourage you to like and follow the podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast platform and share it with someone who could use a little inspiration today. Join the conversation on our Facebook page or email me your thoughts at the address in the show notes. I'm Allan Haw. Until next time, make the most of every moment and remember to live right now.